So our theme today is traditional and contemporary Afro Caribbean music as identity and resistance. Music in the African diaspora, as in its ancestral home, remains the voice of the people despite colonial and post-colonial conditions. Rampant capitalistic commercialization, mounting economic oppression. Despite those things, the music continues to play this role in the community. It's the living documentation of the social conditions and worldview of marginalized communities in their own voice. As such, music in particular and the arts in general play a crucial role in the identity and resistance of working class, immigrant, and stigmatized communities of all types. Afro-Caribbean culture is exemplary in celebrating its Creole nature through vibrant music, dance, and poetry. Simultaneously, the music clearly honors styles, rhythms, eras, events, and pioneers of artistic expression that at once represent our violent history and the immense love that is the essence of resistance. In this, oh, that's it. So, in a nutshell, that's it. You know, the music is this living document that connects us to our ancestors as well as lets us express our opinion, our perspective on our conditions in our own voice. Traditionally, in academia, the people who write the books are not from the communities that are written about. So when our history is really documented most accurately with this musical tradition. It comes with dance, it comes with a deep sense of literature and poetry from within the community, dance, music, and I mentioned there a violent history. So that has to do with colonialism, that has to do with slavery, that has to do with genocide of indigenous peoples, which in my case is hits home because my family's from Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is a tiny island. It's only 100 miles by 35 miles. You can go all the way around the island one day. It's really small. So there was no chance for indigenous communities to escape the genocide that was put upon them, unlike other places in Central and South America where indigenous communities could flee, could continue to move and just move into the jungles, into the Amazon, into the mountains, and go to remote places where they were not pursued or it was difficult to pursue or people lost interest in pursuing. And then communities were formed that way. So they're still threatened, and a lot of them have been eliminated. But in Puerto Rico, it's been pretty complete, the genocide of the indigenous peoples of the Taíno. So our culture, our music is mainly African, of different African roots, and European, mostly Spanish, but not exclusively. Now, in Puerto Rico, there are people there's been a study of DNA of Puerto Ricans, and there's a high level of Taíno evidence in the blood of Puerto Ricans, but it's because of the violence, it's because of the rape of the Taíno women. There were not communities that were able to maintain themselves and their customs as such, but instead you see the Taíno element in the faces, in the features of the people who are mixed, and you could see it, especially in the inland areas of Puerto Rico. So the music connects us. And the instruments themselves tell an interesting story. I want to start with that by demonstrating a couple of the instruments, because each one has an interesting story to tell. So I'm gonna begin with that. I want to start with a very simple instrument, which everybody here kind of knows, because when you are born and before you come home from the hospital, they usually give you one of these, and it's like a toy the way we look at it. But in Latin America, this instrument has really evolved. It's a very important instrument musically, and there's a lot that can be done with it musically. It's a token representation of the indigenous peoples in Puerto Rico, the maraca, because maracas were instruments that the indigenous peoples used. But I say token because maraca is not exclusive to those communities either. A maraca, a shaker like this, is found anywhere in the world, in Asia, in Africa. So it's still, though, for the Puerto Ricans, this instrument and the huicharo, which is like a gourd scraper. Those are instruments that are used in popular music that were also used by indigenous populations. So we remember those and honor the indigenous populations by remembering that these are also Taino instruments. But I want to just show you a little bit about how we use these instruments. Very simple, just to accompany oftentimes like a ballad, a love song. The maracas are used just to keep time like this. They have a very organic sound. It's made out of wood, seeds on the inside. This material on the outside could be made out of a shell of a vegetable that grows on a tree called higuera, but this could be made out of wood, out of a shell, out of a coconut. There's a lot of possibilities. But I want to give you a sample of the sound of the instrument. If I was accompanying a ballad, a bolero, it would just be like that, straight eighth notes like that. Nunca, nunca, vida mía, pienses eso. I'm not going to sing a bolero. I'm not going to put you through me singing a bolero, because that's not what I do, but that's the idea. But what's happened with this instrument, it's evolved. So going from something simple like that to always accompanying song and dance, it could be used this way, just to keep time. It can also be used to demonstrate a very common African element that has been brought into the music in the Americas, which is the coming together of triple meter and duple meter. Musically, in other words, meaning on one side, at one time having a division of three, like this. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, counting like that. 1, 2, 3. And at the same time, dividing the same space into two, like this. 1, 2, 1, 2. To my left, 1, 2, 1, 2. While I'm doing three here, right? 1, 2, 3, 1. So that African element has evolved a lot in music. All types of black music in the Americas. In jazz, this is used, in blues, in samba from Brazil, in Puerto Rico, anywhere in the Americas, you find this phenomenon of triple meter and duple meter at the same time. So when I say it's evolved, we can improvise within this setting. So I want to give you a sample of what the instrument sounds like. It's the maraca. Simple instrument. On the African, oh yes.
I just want to say I completely understand fractions now. You've changed the way I'm teaching fractions.
This instrument is a West African instrument that comes from the ancient kingdom of Dahomey. That is present day, it's West Africa on the coast, which oftentimes has been referred to as the slave coast. But it's present day Benin, Togo, Ghana, and parts of Nigeria, that area. It's called Gankogi. This one comes from the Ewe tradition. We happen to have an Ewe master musician and folklorist here in the Bay Area named C.K. Ladzekpo, who's been a faculty at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, for over 40 years. And he's the person who really brought this tradition here and has taught us all about this. The gankogi, it's a beautiful instrument. It represents beautiful iron work that is centuries old in West Africa. And the instrument, basically, it's a double bell. This is a beautiful sound. What's unique about this bell is that the technique of playing it is that when you play the low bell, you cut it off like that. And it does like a guttural thing with the sound. It goes whoop, and it gives like another element to it. So if I incorporate that into what I'm doing, then it sounds like this. gankogi. That instrument, the gankogi, has another interesting connection for us because a bell, an iron instrument like that, is used also throughout the Americas. Very important in contemporary music, in the carnival music from Trinidad to Brazil to Cuba. They have in the carnival contingents a section that they call hierro, which means iron, and it's made up of descendants of bells like this, double bells. They also use sartenes, which are frying pans that are just turned upside down and the handles nailed to a piece of wood, suspended, so that you're playing the bottom side of the pans with iron or wooden sticks. And then you have brake drums, the inside of a wheel, the metal inside, it's very heavy. The players hold them like this and then play it with a metal striker. It's right there next to the ear. It's pretty deafening. But that iron section is a huge part of the carnival tradition. So that connects us because that's a very important tradition. In our country, in the United States, our national art form, which is jazz, was born in New Orleans and has an intimate connection with Mardi Gras, with our form of carnival in New Orleans. And the metallic sounds, the metal instruments, the percussion, bells, tambourines are a big part of that tradition as well. This instrument is the last one that I want to demonstrate. It's called the Chickadee. And this instrument is found throughout Africa. It goes by different names. It's originally used with just sacred music. However, like a lot of instruments, drums and percussion that have come from Africa, they have made their way into the popular music. And so today we use this in any kind of music, and it's a wonderful instrument because it could be played very delicately, has a big dynamic range from delicate to very loud. And it's one of my favorite instruments. I made this one. They're not that hard to make. They take a lot of patience more than anything because all 1,200 beads go on there one at a time. And you got to make a net, you know, a neck like that, a collar, and hang about 30 double strings down, about down to the floor. And then you take one bead and you push it to the top and you tie a knot and you move over and you do one more. And an hour and a half later, you have one row done. And so it takes a while, you know, it takes patience. When I first started making this instrument, my friends and I took interest in it, and we only saw it in books. You know, we didn't know how to deal with it, but we tried to do the best we could, looking at it and trying to figure it out. One of the most important things is to clean out the inside because it's hollow. It's like, and this is related to a pumpkin. It's a calabaza. It's like a pumpkin. It has seeds and all that stuff on the inside, but you got to clean that out. It dries on the vine. You cut off the top and you clean it out. The cleaner you get the inside, the better sounding the instrument. So trying to get all that stuff out, you know, we tried to figure out how to do it. Like we would make tools out of hangers and metallic things and try to scrape it on the inside. We put liquid inside and that made a mess. And we even put burning objects inside, tried to burn it, and that made a mess too. Until one day I figured out to give my 6-year-old nephew a quarter. He put his whole arm in there and just took everything out. You know, because you can't, you know, something to keep in mind if you get into making them. But I love the instrument because it's very delicate. It can be played lightly by tapping the beads. And it can be played louder by shaking the neck. The beads could be made out of different materials too. Some are much louder than others. You could put seeds, shells, ceramic beads, glass beads, wooden beads. People use all kinds of things on the outside. This has a combination of plastic and wooden beads, plastic and wood on this. And then the third element for the sound is because it's hollow, it has a sound like a drum. We strike it on the bottom. So you got a lot of sounds to work with there. So Chickadee. That's a Chickadee. So these instruments, they're part of a legacy that, in a lot of senses, is like a phoenix, because for the colonizers, Africans were totally stripped from everything, from language, from all the cultural things that they had, their history, their language, their sacred practices, and because of either not a misunderstanding, it's the wrong word, because of an error made either out of ignorance or with intention, there was an excuse made, a spiritual, for religious reasons, saying that the Africans were worshiping many gods, and therefore that was against the Bible. And so the Bible, the church, the religion was used to justify the slavery and enslavement and the stripping of all the cultural elements from Africans and descendants of Africans. And that was, first of all, that's based on erroneous information, because all of the West and Central African religious traditions, sacred traditions, believe in one God. And then a pantheon of Orisha, or saints, very similar to the Christian system. For the Yoruba, Olodumare is the supreme being, and then there's the Orisha, who are like a series of saints who, according to the mythology, they lived on earth at one time. According to their deeds, they were elevated to this Orisha status, very much the same as with Christianity. For the Congo, it's Sambi is the top one, and Fumbes are the spirits that the people deal with, more like the saints. So it's based on false information, first of all. Secondly, that's not a justification, and it shouldn't have been and should never be a justification. But by stripping the Africans and descendants of Africans in that way, the worst nightmare of the colonists was that those traditions would somehow magically reemerge in the New World, which is what happened. And it's very miraculous. It's kind of like taking a mirror and smashing it in the floor into a million pieces and then reconstructing it. So it's going to be different now, because in Africa you have families that were several generations in one place. And so in the New World, it was because of the intentional breaking up of families. You had generations of Cubans and Haitians and what have you, who had grandparents who came from all diverse places in Africa. And so all of those traditions, they grew up with all of those traditions. So a place like Cuba, it was not uncommon that an Afro-Cuban in their family, through their family, would learn about Awakwa, Ijesa, Arara, Congo, and different African traditions. Language, drumming, and it's an oral tradition. Movement, the medicinal use of herbs was a very important part of those sacred traditions, and so treating the environment with respect. All of those traditions believe that, believe that everything in nature has a spirit. Every rock, every grain of sand, every plant, every leaf, every branch has a spirit, and so they proceed with that respect for the environment. They would never destroy the environment. They also honor the ancestors, which is also kind of opposite to what our Western civilization has evolved into, where, the only thing that's respected really is youth and the ideal of young beauty. When you get to a certain age, you're kind of pushed aside. The elders are not respected. They want to put you in an old home. When you die, forget about it. You're forgotten about. Whereas these traditions all respect and communicate with the ancestors. And their traditions are to bring the presence of the ancestors into the room. The ceremonies are with that intention. So they communicate with the ancestors. They still put a glass of water, some food, some sweets, some tobacco, some incense, always for the ancestors. That's a strong African tradition. That's a strong Asian tradition. And it's a strong indigenous tradition as well. So it's something that united all of these quote-unquote third world traditions, from the first world perspective, in uniting their efforts to fight this type of colonial mentality, is the way I would put it. So the drum in particular, and the percussive instruments that have these sacred origins, they're the voice that communicates with the ancestors and brings the tradition into the room. So to this day, the drum, the African drum, was the last thing to come into the popular bands. Even in a place like Cuba, they use bongos, timbales, because they're considered to be Creole instruments. They were developed by descendants of Africans. But the conga drum was African. It represented the Congo. So that drum was held back. It wasn't until almost 1940 that a conga drum became a standard part of a Cuban dance band. But you could still witness the same phenomenon of people's getting their spirits lifted. Even if they're not, it's not a religious thing necessarily, but it's something that comes from that tradition. When you come to a salsa club and you see working class people with their nicest clothes, and you see a transformation take place when the good dancers come out and get in front of the musicians and have a very special relationship, and especially with the rhythm. It's about the rhythm. And they get into like a euphoria, and they really lift their spirits. It's not necessarily a religious thing, but we have to see that connection to the sacred traditions of the drum, people's movement, and channeling, bringing the presence of the ancestors into the room. So all the music that I want to kind of present to you today has that connection, either directly or indirectly. Do you have any questions so far? Okay, I want to show you a few of these slides. So the first one that's up there, the one on the left is pretty obvious what that is, what that's about. That doesn't need a whole lot of explanation, the one on the left. The one on the right, this gentleman, Arturo Alfonso Schaumburg, was a Puerto Rican who was incredible. Born in 1874, moved to Harlem in 1891, and at that time he was identifying himself as an Afro-Borinqueño. Borinquen is the name of the indigenous name of the island of Puerto Rico. So by saying at that time, around the turn of the century, that I'm Afro-Puerto Rican, that's a term that was not used. So he was affirming that. According to an interview with him, he claimed that what put him on his path was when he was a small kid in school, and they were studying history in Puerto Rico, and all the history was European. And when he asked, what about the black history in Puerto Rico? And the teacher said, what black history? There's no black history. Because A, they didn't know, and B, they didn't care to know. They didn't think it was of any importance to inform themselves. So they just say, our history is Spanish. We're a Spanish colony, and that was the deal. So that is what put him on his path. He went on to graduate, got a degree in law, and moved to New York, moved to Harlem. He was there in Harlem long before the Harlem Renaissance. So he was part of the Harlem Renaissance. And he made it his business to collect all of the things African, all of the art objects and literature of African origin that he could find. First in Puerto Rico, but then throughout Latin America. And his collection got so huge that in 1926, the New York Public Library purchased his collection. And to this day, you could go to New York and see the Schaumburg Center for Black Research. That's based on his collection. So he's a very important person in this idea of identity and resistance in Afro-Latin America. His name Schaumburg reflects German slave owners in Puerto Rico. So they gave their name to the Africans. They stripped them of their names. That's where that German name comes from. So he's very important. He was a contemporary of Jose Marti, who was a hero and patriot of the Cuban Revolution of the 1890s, when Cuba finally, when they won the war against Spain, when the last of Spain's colonies, including Puerto Rico, Cuba, Guam, the Philippines, all of the last colonies were in that war of independence against Spain, and they won that war. The United States got involved in that under nefarious conditions. What else is new? We, in 1898, when that war was coming to an end, got involved in that war, and Spain illegally gave Puerto Rico to the United States. I say illegally because in 1897 there was something called, what's the name of it? I'm blanking on the official name, but it was a treaty between Spain and Puerto Rico granting Puerto Rico its autonomy. It's like the ley de autonomía, something like that. It's basically after a century of fighting for their own sovereignty, they were granted by Spain because Spain was losing this war. All the colonies were rising up. They had been throughout the century. And they were losing that war, so they gave Puerto Rico its autonomy in an official writ signed by the governor. But then, in 1898, it was handed over to the United States, and to this day remains a colony in the United States, which has been disastrous for Puerto Rico. As you know, I'm sure because of the what you've seen in the news and the hurricane and the non-response and the fool throwing paper towels to the people in Puerto Rico after the hurricane, all of that is a result of this colonial mentality that is still going on today. This next slide also has to do with Puerto Rico. And the gentleman on the left is Cindo Mangual. He was a plenero. That instrument he's playing is called a pandereta. It's a frame drum. It has Islamic origin. And in Puerto Rico, that style of music is totally connected to the obreros, the working class people. It comes from a time around the turn of the century. You know, in Puerto Rico and Cuba, slavery came to an end toward the end of the century, 1880s. And so I was coinciding with that time, as everywhere in the Americas with the black migration to the urban areas, people looking for work, there's a music that arises. In the United States, certain type of urban blues emerge. In Trinidad, the calypso emerges. In Puerto Rico, it's the plena, it's that style of music. In Cuba, it's the son. And it's a similar kind of music coming from the black community that is very expressive of their migration history. And it's not formal. It's played with whatever instruments are available. It could be played on a guitar, with a harmonica, with an accordion, with a beer bottle hitting with a cap, with a washboard, whatever's available, very informal. The plena evolved to use that drum, the frame drum, and as such, every time there were people in the streets protesting, that drum was there. The plena became associated with street protests, with making social commentary. And it also is known, a lot of people call it the newspaper of the barrio because the community had no radio, no publications, no TV, so it was through the plena that the composers wrote about what was going down. And I'm gonna play a couple examples of that. So the plena is very important. That poster is iconic. It was done by Rafael Tufino, who was probably the most famous muralist and painter from Puerto Rico. And what he did, he made a series of paintings based on plenas that were actually compositions. So the one, for example, the one up on the upper higher left, that, I'm not sure which plena that is, but the ones on the right are identifiable. The one with the horse with the big tail and breathing fire, that was about this beast. And it was a commentary, a metaphor for the United States, invasion of Puerto Rico and being this colonial beast that was dictating and keeping the Puerto Rican people down. They wrote a plena about that. The next one shows a shark eating a guy with a suit holding a briefcase. That's an American lawyer. And it's something that happened in Puerto Rico where a guy was swimming in there in Puerto Rico. There were a lot of lawyers there because all these U.S. businesses had moved in there to control the cutting of the cane, sugar plantations, factories that were doing garment and textiles. So a lot of businessmen there. The guy went swimming and a shark got him. And this gentleman, Cindo Mangual, wrote a plena documenting that. It says, Tintorera del mal, Tintorera del mal, Tintorera del mal, se ha comido un americano. The shark has eaten an American. I mean, just literally. So that's the role of the plena. This guy in the middle is Rafael Cepeda. He's part of a family. There was a couple families in Puerto Rico that preserved the most African style of music in Puerto Rico, which is the bomba. The bomba almost disappeared because Puerto Rico, as I mentioned before, is tiny, little island. And the bomba existed in the plantations and sugar mills on the coast in a few spots, 5 or 6 spots around the coast. When slavery came to an end, those families, the bomba tradition, this African style, the most African style of drumming, I'm going to show you a clip of it, was preserved by families. And across the centuries, almost disappeared. If it wasn't for a certain family, in particular this family, the Familia Cepeda. He was the patriarch of the family, the most recent patriarch that we know of. But his grandparents were playing bomba. So it came through the family ties. And to this day, the Familia Cepeda remains. They have a school in Puerto Rico where they teach bomba. His granddaughter lives in Oakland and teaches bomba here in Oakland. So it's an incredible tradition. We were very lucky that those families preserved the bomba because it could easily have disappeared. A lot of African forms came and went. This guy is another important guy, Afro-Puerto Rican, who brought the bomba and the plena into the dance halls in the 50s. This picture's from 1955. The year before, in 54, he formed a group. And at that time, the Cuban rhythms and dances were the real popular ones in the States and in Latin America. The cha-cha-cha, the mambo, the son. All the people that wanted to dance, the Cuban things were the hippest things, the Cuban rhythms and instruments. So what he did, he brought the bomba into the dance halls. This is a Cuban tumbadora, conga drum, and he brought the Puerto Rican rhythm, which is normally played on its own style drum, onto this Cuban drum, and they used timbales, another Cuban instrument, and bongos, Cuban instrument. And they played Puerto Rican rhythms and Cuban rhythms. And again, it did a lot to repopularize, not only in the black community, but in the working class community, very Creolized community, to repopularize the bomba. And that also preserved it for another couple generations of Puerto Ricans. Today, the bomba enjoys its most wide acceptance because now there's been a couple generations of Puerto Rican youth who have embraced the bomba. And it's not just in the black community, it's all the Puerto Ricans. And there's bombas now all over the place, what they call bombazos, where somebody will say, there's going to be a bombazo in the courtyard, at the College of Alameda such and time. They send out a social media, and boom, everybody shows up with their drums, and they play and dance bomba. And that's a thing now. People are really taking an interest in learning the traditions of the bomba. Okay, so that's that. I want to play you a clip of the Familia Cepeda. What I'm going to play you now is this gentleman's family, his sons, his grandkids, all of them. It's a clip from a film called Dancing the Drum that was made by a Oakland and Berkeley-based film company called Searchlight Films, called Dancing the Drum. It's about the Familia Cepeda. I'm going to play you like a 7-minute clip from that, and so you could see and experience what the bomba is about, and see if you could notice what the obvious African elements are, and some that are not so obvious. This is the Familia Cepeda. This is a picture from the mid-70s in Puerto Rico. Those are several of Don Rafael's sons and grandkids. Let me see. Oh, this is not a pointer, or is it? No. Okay, well, all the way on the left in that photo, that's Don Rafael. That's the grandfather. Then that's all his family after that. The woman third from the left is his wife. She's the mother of most of the older kids there. This is Chichito Cepeda, who was the youngest son of Don Rafael, and he lived in the Bay Area for a while. He shared a lot of his tradition with us in the Bay Area up until the time he had an untimely death in a car accident, unfortunately, here in California. So I've been sharing with you the Puerto Rican perspective. This is a Cuban side now. This gentleman right here, Gonzalo Esencial, is a great example of the idea of resistance. He was an Afro-Cuban rumbero. He's considered to be the most prolific and famous of the composers of rumbas. Now, the rumba is this style of music that comes from the hood, it coincides with the ending of slavery in Cuba, goes back to before the turn of the century. The places where the rumba developed were in slave barracks, were in solares, which were big tenements that used to be at one time homes for rich families that were abandoned after the colonial period ended. And then they became like tenements, basically. But they're called solar. It comes from the word solar, from the sun, because they're enclosed behind walls, and there's always an open air section in the middle of it. So all the families would convene in that area to play rumba. So it's a very connected to these working class black neighborhoods where the rumba is born. And it becomes, of course, Creolized, so it's not limited to the black community, but it still to this day remains the most important, I think, expression of the black community. I was in Cuba in July, and I saw the rumba, how it's evolved. It's really incredible to see how these young Cubans, mostly black Cubans, have embraced the rumba and express it in their own way. It's evolved a great deal. Where he's very special is because you know, he was born in 1919. He grew up in a very repressive Cuba, a very racist, repressive Cuba. And he wrote rumbas that are some of the most popular ones today. And many of them, they're love songs, but they're very poetic, they're very philosophical, but he also was very outspoken. So he wrote, like some of the ones he wrote, the one called Donde Están los Cubanos? Where are the Cubans? That's a rumba that he wrote in response to American soldiers who were in Havana and peed on the statue of Jose Marti. And nothing happened to those soldiers. And so he wrote this rumba saying, what the hell? You know, where are the Cubans? Who's standing up for that? He went to jail. He spent a couple years in jail for writing such a rumba, because the government was like that. It's a dictatorship before the revolution. There's a dictatorship after the revolution too. But he comes from this time when, the black community in Cuba had it super bad. They didn't have opportunity to get an education. There's a lot of racism. One of the things that the revolution attempted to do and achieved to a certain degree, not totally, was to concede, to admit and claim the black roots of Cuban culture. Because up until that time, it was always denied. Just like with Arturo Schaumburg at the turn of the century, before the turn of the century, the same thing in Cuba. The ethnographers, the ethnomusicologists were not writing about African roots because they didn't know, and they didn't think it was worth knowing. So the old black Cubans always, that I befriended many of them because a few of them were here. Armando Peraza, Francisco Aguabella, some great Cuban drummers ended up in the Bay Area. And they always shared with me that even though they left Cuba way before the revolution, they totally supported the revolution, because they would say, the people that are complaining about the revolution, the Cubans who left because of the revolution, they don't know what it was like to be black in Cuba before the revolution. And their experience, bears that out. So this guy's name, his nickname was Tío Tom, which means Uncle Tom. And it's not, when you translate it, it wasn't like that. They didn't consider him to be an Uncle Tom by any means. He was celebrated in the black community in Cuba, even though he spent several stints in jail behind what he was writing. Okay, one more I want to share with you, this slide in particular. I love this slide because, let me see, can I get over here? Oh man, I'm learning how to do this. All right, I love this slide because this group is arguably the most important and famous group of rumba groups of all time. They were formed in 1952. That photo's from 1956, and it's a group that still exists today. A lot of the family members, it's passed down, from generation to generation. But this group took the rumba to a spot, a high. They lifted the bar way high, and in 1952, they recorded on 45s. What was new in Cuba at that time were the jukeboxes in the bars, and they recorded a 45 with rumba. And the rumba is just drums, percussion, and voices, that's all. This group had, the three guys sitting down in front were to this day, the greatest singers in the history of rumba. They had beautiful voices. And they had these great drummers behind them, and they brought an elegance to the rumba. This is like the most profound expression of black Cuba, from the hood, from Matanzas, and from Cuba, and from Havana. And they came out like that, dressed like that, with suits. It reminds me of the brothers that play blues, the old-time blues players and jazz players. We look at the photos of Thelonious Monk, of Dizzy. They're not folks who came from money, but they always were clean. They always had, present themselves. And, and we all had that in our families. My grandparents who were musicians, and those who were not. They were merchant marines, they were truck drivers, but when they would go to a party or to a thing, suit and tie, fresh flower. My grandfather had a flower in his lapel and a suit and tie every day of his life that I saw him, whether or not he left the house. And so that they carry that. That's something that just in the black community is a thing, about the dignity, about the respect that these musicians commanded. Now, to the colonizing mentality, they were ignorant. They didn't have formal education, they didn't have musical education, but the musical level of what they presented was as complex as any music that you hear anywhere. A level of rhythm, a level that comes from the sacred tradition of trance music, where they lay down a rhythm that is just deep. But then there's improvisation that happens on top that communicates with the ancestors. And then they're singing beautifully, and they're bringing in elements from their African sacred traditions, elements of Abakwa, Arara, Ijesa, Yoruba, all Congo. All these elements come through the rumba into popular music. So these gentlemen represent a history in Cuba that is like just incredible. And they spoke all these languages. So they're brilliant. They're historians, they're griots, they hold the oral tradition of Black Cuba. They speak Kikongo, they speak Awakwa, they speak Yoruba, they speak Spanish. They're like incredible. And it reminds me of one story quickly that I want to recite to you, which is really represents this theme very well. The dean of all Cuban ethnomusicologists was a gentleman named Fernando Ortiz, Cuban ethnomusicologist. He was a white Cuban, Spanish descent, who went to Spain before the turn of the century in the 1800s to study law. So he comes back as a lawyer from Spain into Havana. His first job is prosecuting people who were accused of witchcraft. Of course, they're all black. When he interviews them, he realizes that, oh my God, this is the people that hold the oral tradition of Cuba's black history that's not written anywhere. He recognized that. He quit his job and he wrote his first book that's called Los Negros Brujos, the Black Witches. And after interviewing them, it started him on a career. He spent the rest of his life up until 1971 when he passed, writing to expose Cuba's black history. And he wrote volumes and volumes and volumes of material showing Cuban instruments, Cuban language found in Cuba, Cuban pantomime and Cuban theater, Cuban construction, African, I'm talking about African, I'm saying Cuban, I mean Afro-Cuban, African, at a time when all the ethnographers were in denial about Cuba's black history. So that element is represented in the black community to this day. Like I mentioned, I was there in July, and you could see it in action. I went to a club, and in the club where you might expect a DJ and stuff, they're playing rumba, and they're dancing oricha. They come with oricha costumes, and they play bembe, and it's like an amazing deepness in the roots that are still informing the young people today. And they're very stylish. People, there's a hip hop aesthetic. All the people, if you go to Havana and you just drop there and you go to a place, you see the people that wear their dress, you wouldn't know where you're at. You might think you're in Philadelphia or Oakland or somewhere. You see people with hip hop style, a lot of sports stuff and bling and chains and hat, baseball hats, but they're playing deep African music, and it's like it's incredible. So if I have enough time, I want to play a couple audio samples, if I could. Are we cool time-wise? I don't want to abuse your kindness. So the first piece that I want to play for you is a piece of Congo origin, and it's called Palo. And this is a study unto itself. In a nutshell, what Palo is, it's Congo view of life, it's Congo tradition. Palo means stick or branch. A branch is a palo. But what it represents in the sacred tradition is that the medicinal use of herbs. In Africa, all over West and Central Africa, people know the medicinal use of herbs. So that was one of the things that during slavery, they come to a new place and they don't have that, but they knew the importance of it. So the priority for Africans and descendants of Africans was to learn the medicinal use of the local herbs, which they learned from the indigenous peoples. So they had that here. So the Palo tradition it's represented, the altar for the Palo is the proverbial, westernized, stigmatized witch's cauldron, a pot that has all kind of stuff in it. But what's in it are palos, branches and leaves and twigs, and they know what each one is and what they're used for medicinally. They know the magical and medicinal use of all those herbs. They have dirt from the mountaintop, dirt from the valley, dirt from the cemetery, some sand from the edge of the ocean, dirt from the edge of the river, stones, all that, that's what's in that pot. And the reason for it is because during slavery times, they were invoking the spirit of all nature, as well as the local spirits, as well as their own ancestors, to rise up against slavery. And that's all that they had was this tradition of their ancestors and palos. The palos were also these big, long sticks and poles that they fought with and banged on the floor and were weapons. So this tradition of palo, it still exists in Cuba. It's actually a religion that people use during slavery times. The sole purpose was to rise out of slavery and for abolition of slavery. During that time, the way it's danced is to stomp on the floor, because the Congo spirits come from the earth, and the music is always fast, and it's really a war dance. It's a war against slavery. So the rhythm is fast. The rhythm is played. They use a bell, and the bell part goes like this. Always fast like that, and they dance here like to it. Play like that in that tempo. And the way it's danced is to invoke spirit and to fire up people to rise up against armed colonizers. So the way it's danced is like that. It's meant to fire up. And people dance like the energy right away is big. So that's what we're going to hear now. This is Palo from a group called Afro Cuba de Matanzas. It starts out with rezo, which is a prayer. So they do a prayer to nature first to open the road, and then when the rhythm starts and the drums start, you're going to hear the energy that I'm talking about. His name was Gregorio Hernandez. He was a founding member of the National Folklore Troupe in Cuba in 1962. He's a gentleman who was a mentor for me. I got to meet him in my first trip to Cuba in 1990. And he was one of those guys, just an oral historian, a walking history book. One of those guys that when they die, it's like burning down libraries with all the information in his head. He could sing, and he knew drumming and singing and traditional rites and rituals from all these different African groups that existed in Cuba. So this particular thing, he was also a rumbero. So this is a rumba. He's singing. You're going to hear his voice. It's a deep rumba. That's called Cuando del África salí. It means when I left Africa. And it's the first voice of a slave leaving, somebody who's leaving, being stolen from the continent, coming on a slave ship, being treated like a dog, thrown into the hills, their son sold into slavery. It's deep like that. It's that kind of a song. You're going to feel that even if you don't speak Spanish. You're going to hear that. And then the chorus, it builds up to what's called the estribillo, which is a call and response vocal, which is a very African element that exists to this day in popular music. Call and response vocals, where the chorus makes a fixed response and the lead singer improvises. His improvisations, here, the chorus says, El amo no quiere que yo toque el tambor, means that the overseer doesn't want me to play my drum. And he's saying, that's where I'm drawing the line. So he's saying, I've been through all this, and now he's telling me I can't play my drum. And so then he goes on to improvise and lists like a history of all the different African drums that exist in Cuba that he plays. And he's saying, I spoke to Chabiaca y yo voy a tocar mi ngoma. He's talking about Congo tradition, the Congo lead drum. He talks about the abakwa, the bata from Nigeria, the song. He talks about all these drumming traditions. He says, if he doesn't let me play, yo me vuelvo cimarrón, means I'll run away again, meaning that he was already a runaway slave that they brought back, and he'll do it again. He's just saying, that's the final thing. So it's a powerful tune on a lot of levels. You're going to feel the vibe of it. Also, the style of playing, it's an old style of playing rumba that you don't hear too much anymore. There's two conga drums that play like a melody, which is not the usual one that you hear in rumba, but it's very funky. And then there's a lead drummer, a gentleman named Maximino Duquesne, one of the master drummers in Cuba, who I just saw, the guy I've known for many years, and when I was there in July, I got to hang out with him a little bit. He's still, even though he's in his 80s, he's a monster. The way he plays, the sound he gets, and the phrasing, the way he plays, the rhythm, the way he colors and embellishes the rhythm on the high-pitched drum, very, very masterful, let me say. So we're about at that time. I'm going to have to move pretty soon, so I want to ask you if you have any questions at all. I'm happy to hear it. Huh?
What was the name of that Afro Puertorriqueño rhythm that you talked about.
Bomba,
Bomba.
bomba.
Beautiful, beautiful. What's the origins of that in terms of perhaps African regionally, West Africa?
You know, I'm glad you asked because I was thinking about that when we were watching it, and then I forgot to mention it because there's controversy about it. With a lot of African retention in the New World, there was no documentation for centuries, and so trying to figure out what year something happened or where it came from, and especially under the circumstances very violent of slavery, it wasn't so clear because those lines were not kept clear. So in Puerto Rico, a lot of the Puerto Ricans, most of the Puerto Ricans have said they like to claim that the bomba is one of the oldest styles of music in the Americas, 500 years old. But, that's controversial because, those Africans were not allowed to bring drums with them here, and they were not given drums right away when they came here. So that's something that evolved over a long period of time. The actual, when we talk about the bomba, one thing that has been slow to catch on in Puerto Rico, and this, we were talking about this last night because there's some master Puerto Rican bomberos here in town that arrived yesterday, and they're doing workshops around here at La Peña. They did one last night at City College in San Francisco and at the Mission Cultural Center. And they mentioned that, 500 years old. But I'm thinking, 500 years, that means in 1500, you're telling me in 1500? No, they weren't doing that in 1500. But another friend of mine who comes from a bomba family in Puerto Rico has done academic study on this. And he says there's no mention of bomba before 1800. And he makes a very strong point, which is there's a style of drumming in Cuba called tumba francesa, means French drum. And it comes, they're very clear about how it got there. It comes because of the French, of the Haitian Revolution. And so in 1802, when Haiti becomes a republic, there's building up to that moment. And right after, there was a migration of Afro-Haitians and Haitian landowners and slave owners and freed slaves and a whole lot of Haitians went all over the Caribbean. They came to New Orleans, has a lot to do with our jazz French roots in New Orleans. The Louisiana Purchase happened at that time when the United States bought that whole area of the southwest United States from France, 1803, same time. And also that French influence comes to Cuba. When you look at a map, Cuba is this big island in the middle, and from the eastern tip of Cuba, on a clear day, you can see Haiti. Haiti's right there. And then on the other side of the island, there's Puerto Rico. So those islands are close. They got, that Haitian migration came to those places. So the point is that the bomba comes to Puerto Rico the same way that the tumba francesa came to Cuba with the Haitians. The Puerto Ricans have been slow to claim that. Some of them are starting to say that now, and the evidence is irrefutable because, for this reason, the tumba francesa and the bomba traditionally are sung in Creole, in French, the same way the Africans speak French in Haiti. That's how you sing bomba. The bomba songs, the original songs, are in Creole, just like same in tumba francesa. And the name of the instruments and the name of the rhythms are the same. So what they call premier for the lead drum that comes from Haiti, it's a French word. In tumba francesa in Cuba, that's called primo. They changed it, they Spanglicized it in Puerto Rico, primo. The accompanying drum is called buleador. In Cuba, it's called bula, that comes from the Haitian root. They have a rhythm called juba, mason. Those are the same names of the rhythms in Puerto Rico. So, and the French never controlled or invaded Puerto Rico. So the only way that French thing could have gotten there is with the Haitians in 1800. So although there was probably some drumming tradition, there's evidence of that. There was some drumming going on before the Haitians came in right after 1800. But what we know today as the bomba, how it's played, the name, the nomenclature, the traditional songs, it's very Haitian. So now when you want to look for the African roots of it, then you have to look to Congo. To the Congo, but we use that in a very general sense because the Congo, what they call Congo in the New World, covers a huge area connected by the Bantu linguistic groups that stretch from what was formerly called Congo, what's the independent Republic of the Congo now, formerly Rhodesia, Rwanda, all from the east to west, from Mozambique to Angola, down to South Africa. It's all connected with Bantu language groups. And all of that is represented. There's people from, descendants from all these different areas in Cuba. The Congo tradition in Cuba doesn't come from one of those areas. So therefore, when you say Congo in Cuba, you're speaking in very general terms.
We do the same thing here when we say West Africa.
Exactly.
Right? Which is, there's Ashanti.
That's right.
Wolof, there's so many.
Yeah.
So we have to say, be very general. in
That's
how
right.
We identify West Africa.
Precisely, same situation.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I have a question.
Mhm.
That one slide where you have the three different people,
Mhm.
that instrument, what was that called? The one,
Pandereta.
is that where the tambourine, is the tambourine based off of that?
Yeah, it is a tambourine without the jingles.
Without the,
Yeah, but that kind of an instrument, a frame drum like that, is it comes to the New World with Islamic roots because it comes. It's a common instrument with and without jingles in the Middle East and in North Africa. That Islamic migration that comes through North Africa and then also through Eastern Europe ends up in Spain with the gypsy people. And what came to be called gypsy. Those people were known as Romani before. There's a great film called The Romani Trail that describes that movement. But so then there was, after that, subsequently, almost 8 centuries of Islamic Moorish conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. They controlled Spain and Portugal. So at that point, there's all this African element is already in the Spanish tradition that comes to the New World. So a lot of times people will say, well, there's a Spanish tradition and the African tradition. The Spanish tradition came already charged with a lot of African elements. Even the string instruments. We always say there's the Spanish guitar and the African drum. The guitar also comes from Islam. The guitar, the laoud, which is the oud, is an Islamic Middle Eastern instrument, North African instrument. All that comes to Spain from Africa and from Islam. And then from Spain comes to the New World, where people would look at it like, well, there's the Spanish and the African, but the African element was already there. And so that drum is part of that representation. It's a tambourine without the jingles, and that also came across Africa. It didn't only go through North Africa to Spain, it came across Africa so that Islam, there's a lot of Islamic elements in the Congo and in Nigeria and West Africa too that came right across the continent.